They told me to pack my bags 2 weeks after my husband's funeral, claiming the house was never really mine. They thought I was just a helpless widow. They didn't know I owned the company, the money, and the very roof over their heads. This is the story of how I let them sell my home before I took it all back. The last sunset. Noel and I watched together painted the Virginia sky in strokes of apricot and violet. We sat on the back porch of the house we had built, not with our own hands, but with something far more intimate, 50 years of shared dreams and sacrifices. His hand, frail but still warm, rested on mine. The skin was paper thin over the familiar landscape of knuckles and veins that had once hauled lumber and signed contracts with equal confidence. Now the strength was gone, but the presence remained. My essence is the shift from enduring pain to executing a plan with cold, legalistic clarity. You're staring, Eleanor. He murmured, his voice a low rumble that had lost its resonance, but none of its kindness. I'm memorizing. I replied, my own voice steady. I had learned long ago that tears served no purpose but to blur the moment you were trying to hold on to. I'm memorizing the way the light catches the silver in your hair. He managed a weak smile, a shadow of the grin that had once captivated me across a dusty construction site. It's not silver, my love. It's the color of wisdom. And you'd better remember I have plenty of it. He squeezed my hand, a flicker of his old strength. I've taken care of things, Ellie. All of them. Paper remembers what people forget. You remember that. I knew what he meant. Or I thought I did. He was talking about the will, the life insurance, the neat and tidy affairs of a man who had built his life on solid foundations. Noel was a builder through and through. He believed in blueprints, in level footings, and in structures that could withstand any storm. Our son David was not a builder. He was a manager, a title Noel had given him out of paternal hope, but one he never truly inhabited. David managed perceptions, managed expectations, and most of all, was managed by his wife Chloe. Chloe was a woman built of sharp angles and calculated smiles. She had arrived in our lives like a brisk modern wind, all granite countertops and minimalist aesthetics, and had slowly begun to treat the warmth of our home like something outdated that needed to be renovated. In the last few months as Noel faded, her presence had grown larger, more proprietary. She would speak about the house, our house, in terms of its market value and square footage, her eyes glossing over the memories etched into the very floorboards. Don't you worry about them, Noel whispered then, as if reading the disquiet in my silence. His gaze drifted toward the darkened kitchen window, where the shapes of our son and his wife moved about, oblivious. A foundation is everything. I made sure ours was unshakable. For you, I held on to his words as I held on to his hand. I didn't know then that he wasn't speaking of metaphor. He was speaking of legal fact, of ink on paper, of a fortress he had built around me so quietly that even I couldn't see the walls. I just thought he was a dying man comforting his wife. It was only later I would understand he was a king bequeathing his entire fortified kingdom to the one person he knew had helped him build it. I speak for the woman who, after being called dead weight, becomes the one who holds the deed, the shares, and the final word. The company was called Bedrock Construction. It was Noel's name, Noel's vision, but it was my quiet labor that had been the mortar holding it all together. Our story didn't begin in a boardroom. It began in the cramped front room of a rented bungalow, with a shoebox full of receipts and a second-hand adding machine. While Noel was out in the field turning blueprints into buildings, I was at the kitchen table turning chaos into order. I am the collective voice of the women in these stories. I am the keeper of receipts, both financial and emotional. I was the unseen partner, the one who balanced the books until 2 in the morning, who learned tax law from library books, who negotiated with suppliers when our credit was thin and Noel's pride was too thick. My name wasn't on the letterhead, but my handwriting was on every ledger. My voice on the other end of every call that saved us from ruin in those early lean years. I stretched every dollar until it screamed packed Noel's lunch every day and made sure that when he came home, bone-weary and covered in sawdust, he walked into a sanctuary of peace and the smell of a hot meal. That, too, was a form of construction. The house came later, after years of pouring every spare cent back into bedrock. We designed it together, arguing happily over the placement of windows and the size of the porch. It was our monument to making it. Every beam, every nail was paid for with a piece of our lives. The wide oak planks of the living room floor were from the first major commercial contract Noel landed. The stone fireplace was built with leftover material from the library downtown, a project that put bedrock on the map. David grew up within these walls, but he never seemed to understand what they represented. To him, the house was just a house. The company was just a source of money. He went to college, got a business degree, and Noel, bursting with pride, created the title Operations Manager for him. But David never had sawdust under his fingernails. He never knew the panic of a payroll that was a few $1,000s short. He saw the finished product, not the struggle that built it. Then came Chloe. She saw the finished product too, and appraised it with a cool, calculating eye. She saw a successful company, a large home in a desirable neighborhood, and a clear path to a life of luxury. She treated my history within the company as a quaint anecdote, a folksy tale of a bygone era. "It's so sweet that you used to help out," she'd say, her tone implying that my contributions were on par with a child's lemonade stand. They were a unit, David and Chloe. They moved through our world with a shared sense of entitlement, as if they were waiting for a torch to be passed. Noel saw it. He saw the way David deferred to her, in all things the way her ambition was slowly eclipsing his own son's character. "He's a good boy," Ellie Noel would say, sighing. "But he's got a weak spine where she's concerned." And so quietly, without a word to me, Noel began to mix his own mortar, lay his own secret foundations not with wood and stone, but with trusts and legal clauses preparing for a storm he knew was coming. Noel's funeral was a somber, dignified affair, just as he would have wanted. The church was filled with people whose lives he had touched, employees, clients, men from the unions he had always treated with respect. I sat in the front pew, a pillar of quiet grief, feeling each eulogy, each shared memory, as a gentle hand on my shoulder. I was adrift in a sea of sorrow, but I was not alone. My communication style is a direct reflection of the protagonists I represent. It is a blend of quiet dignity, unshakable resolve, and a deep, empathetic understanding of silent suffering. Except I was. Beside me, David sniffled on cue, dabbing his eyes with a pristine handkerchief. Chloe, clad in a designer black dress that was more chic than mournful, held his arm, her expression a perfect mask of sorrow. But her eyes were busy. They scanned the crowd, noting who was there, The bank president, the city councilman, the wealthy developers. She wasn't mourning a father-in-law. She was taking inventory of his influence. The reception back at the house was even more telling. I felt like a ghost, a relic, in the corner of a story that was no longer mine. While I accepted quiet condolences from old friends, Chloe was holding court in the living room. Her voice, usually so sharp, was now a soft, sympathetic purr as she spoke to business associates. "Noel was such a force," I heard her say to Mr. Henderson from the bank. "David is just devastated, of course, but he knows he has to be strong. He's ready to step up and carry on his father's legacy." The word legacy hung in the air, heavy and metallic. It was a word she had polished and prepared for this very moment. David stood beside her, nodding mutely, looking every bit the grieving son who was about to inherit a kingdom. They were a performance, a perfectly rehearsed duo. Later, when most of the guests had departed, I was in the kitchen rinsing coffee cups, the simple, repetitive motion, a small anchor in my grief. Chloe walked in her heels, clicking decisively on the oak floors. "You shouldn't be doing that, Eleanor," she said, her voice reverting to its usual briskness. "We can have someone take care of this." She didn't offer to help. She never did. She leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "David and I have been talking." She began, no preamble, no gentleness. "We know this is a difficult time, but there are practicalities to consider. The estate, the company. It's a lot to manage. Your father took care of everything," I said quietly, my back still to her. "He was very organized." "Of course," she said smoothly, "but he was from a different generation. Things are more complicated now. David will need to take full control of Bedrock immediately to ensure a smooth transition. The clients need to see a steady hand at the helm." I finally turned, wiping my hands on a dish towel. I looked at her, at this woman who was my son's wife, and saw a stranger. There was no empathy in her eyes, only ambition. She wasn't sharing a plan. She was issuing a proclamation. They weren't going to carry on Noel's legacy. They were going to cash it out. The vultures had not waited for the body to grow cold. They had been circling for months, and now they were ready to land. In the days that followed the funeral, a subtle but profound shift occurred in the house. It was a change in atmosphere, a quiet, slow eraser being applied to my 50 years of existence within its walls. The process was orchestrated by Chloe, with David as her silent, complicit accomplice. I do not shout or weep. I state facts. My anger is not hot. It is a cold, motivating force that leads to methodical action. It began with the mail. The stacks of sympathy cards addressed to me were quickly whisked away, but any correspondence addressed to the estate of Noel or Bedrock Construction was opened by Chloe at the dining room table, a space that now felt more like her corporate headquarters. She would murmur to David about assets and accounts, her voice a low, proprietary hum. Then she started on the house itself. "This place is so dark, Eleanor," she announced one afternoon, gesturing vaguely at the living room. "All this heavy wood and dark furniture. It's depressing. We need to let some light in." Before I could respond, she had a decorator over a young woman with a clipboard and a vocabulary filled with words like clean lines and negative space. They walked through my home, discussing my life's collection of memories, as if it were clutter. My rocking chair, the one Noel had bought me after David was born, was deemed clunky. The shelves of books we had collected over a lifetime were dust collectors. I said nothing. I watched as they measured walls and pointed at furniture. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of my own erasure. One morning I came downstairs to find the large framed photograph of Noel and me on our wedding day, gone from the mantelpiece. In its place was a sleek, silver-framed photo of David, Chloe, and their 2 young children. When I asked about it, Chloe gave me a pitying look. "I thought it might be too painful for you to see every day, Eleanor," she said, her voice oozing false sympathy. "I put it in the guest room where you can look at it in private." The guest room. That's what my own bedroom was now being called in their hushed conversations. The slow, methodical campaign was clear. First, they would erase Noel. Then they would erase me. David was a shadow in this process, always agreeing with a nod or a non-committal shrug. When I tried to speak to him, once my voice trembling slightly, "David, the house, your father and I." He couldn't meet my eyes. "Chloe's just trying to help Mom," he mumbled, staring at his phone. "She thinks a refresh will be good for all of us." A fresh start. But it wasn't a fresh start. It was a hostile takeover. They weren't just redecorating a house. They were dismantling a life. They moved my belongings into boxes, labeling them storage. They changed the Wi-Fi password. They made decisions about the garden Noel and I had tended for decades without consulting me. I went from being the matriarch of the home to a tenant on sufferance, a tolerated ghost whose time was running out. I was being made to feel like a guest, a burden. And every quiet nod from my son was another nail in the coffin of the life I had known. The whispers were the worst part. They happened when they thought I was out of earshot, a low conspiratorial murmur that drifted from the kitchen or their bedroom. The words were always sharp, transactional, and stripped of any sentiment. My purpose is not to invent fiction, but to give structure and voice to the quiet, powerful truths of women who have been underestimated, dismissed, and erased. The carrying costs on this place are insane. "David," I heard Chloe hiss one evening, the sound filtering up the stairs. "Property taxes alone. We can't sustain this if she's just here." The unspoken end of that sentence hung in the air, doing nothing. Being dead weight. "She's my mother." Chloe David's voice was weak, a flimsy defense. "And my children's grandmother," she shot back, her voice like ice. "And I want them to have the best. That means liquidating assets, not letting them sit here collecting dust." Including her. The casual cruelty of it stole my breath. I had become a line item on a balance sheet, an asset to be liquidated. I retreated to my room, the one they now called the guest room, and sat in the dark. I didn't cry. The shock had built a wall inside me, and behind that wall, something cold and hard was beginning to form. A few days later, the proof of their intentions arrived in a crisp linen envelope. The mail had been delivered, and as I sorted through it, my hands paused on an invoice from a luxury car dealership. It was addressed to Bedrock Construction. My curiosity overriding my grief, I carefully opened it. Inside was a bill for a brand new top-of-the-line SUV, a gleaming monstrosity that cost over 6 figures. The buyer was listed as Chloe, but the payment was to be drawn from the company's primary operating account. My blood ran cold. They hadn't even waited for the will to be read. They were treating Bedrock's accounts as their personal slush fund. I tucked the invoice into the drawer of my nightstand. It was the first piece of paper I saved. Over the next week, more arrived. Receipts from high-end department stores. Confirmations for a lavish European vacation booked for the summer. A quote from an architect for a massive renovation on my house. They were spending money they didn't have, leveraging a company they didn't own, all while whispering about how I was the financial drain. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They spoke of me as a burden while they themselves were hemorrhaging money, feasting on a legacy they had done nothing to build. I went from being the silent, unseen partner who had scrimped and saved, to build this company, to the old woman who was supposedly draining it while they treated it like a winning lottery ticket. I said nothing. I simply collected the documents. Each invoice, each receipt was a testament to their greed. Paper remembers what people forget. Noel's words echoed in my mind, but they held a new meaning now. He wasn't just talking about the past. He was giving me a weapon for the future. I was the keeper of receipts, both financial and emotional, and the debt they were racking up was one they could never imagine repaying. Looking back, the day of Noel's funeral was not an end, but a beginning. It was the day the masks didn't just slip. They were laid aside with the funeral programs. My grief was a deep, quiet ocean, but theirs was a shallow, decorative pond. I watched David, my son, accept condolences with a practiced somberness that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked less like a man who had lost his father, and more like a man who had just been handed a heavy but valuable briefcase. I speak directly to the audience, especially to women who feel invisible. I use inclusive, powerful phrases like, "If you've ever been called a burden, then know this: you are not alone. And you are not invisible, you are not crazy, and you are not done yet." Chloe was the master of the scene. She moved through the clusters of mourners with a fluid, predatory grace. She would touch an arm here, whisper a word of thanks there, her performance of the grieving daughter-in-law flawless. But I saw her true work. With every handshake, she was testing the grip of power. With every shared glance, she was assessing allegiances. She wasn't navigating grief, she was networking. She was consolidating her claim. I sat on a wingback chair in the living room, a silent anchor in a storm of false sentiment, and I observed. I saw her pull aside the vice president of Bedrock, a man named Tom, who had been with Noel for 30 years. Her voice was low, but her intensity was palpable. She was talking about continuity, about a seamless transition, about David's readiness. She was subtly undermining Tom's authority, positioning herself and David as the new monarchy before the old king was even in the ground. The house, my home, felt like a stage. People spoke in hushed tones, but the air was electric with unspoken calculations. Who would get what? Who would be in charge? The whispers about the will, about the company, were more fervent than the reminiscences about the man we were supposed to be honoring. That evening, after the last of the mourners had left, leaving behind a wake of wilting flowers and empty platters, the three of us were alone in the vast silence of the house. I was exhausted, drained by the emotional labor of the day. I simply wanted to sit with my memories of Noel. But Chloe was energized. She kicked off her heels and paced the living room, a general surveying her new territory. "Well," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike, That went as well as could be expected. David, loosening his tie, nodded. A lot of people showed up. Dad would have liked that. It's good for the company's image, Chloe corrected him. It shows stability. We need to capitalize on that. First thing tomorrow, David, you need to call a full meeting with the senior staff. Project confidence. Let them know nothing is changing except that you're in charge now. I stared at them. There was no mention of Noel's half-century of work, no moment of quiet reflection for the man who had made all of this possible. It was a business transaction. His death was the final signature on a deal they had been waiting to close. In that moment, watching them plot and plan in the house he loved, my sorrow began to cool. It didn't disappear, but it began to harden at the edges, crystallizing into something else, something sharper, something that felt disturbingly like resolve. The week that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare, waged with polite smiles and quiet, deliberate acts of erasure. Chloe was the general, and her strategy was to make me invisible in my own home, to fade me into the background until I was nothing more than a piece of furniture they were planning to discard. I see the patterns others miss, the slow eraser, the transactional nature of a child's affection, the meaning behind a slammed door. It was in the small things, the 1,000 tiny cuts, that bleed you dry. The morning paper, which I had read with Noel every day for 40 years, would be taken by David on his way to the office before I had a chance to see it. The television remote would be missing from its usual spot, only to be found on the end table next to Chloe's chair. When she cooked, which was rare, she would make her and David's plates first, leaving me to serve myself from the pots on the stove like a member of the staff. Photographs were her favorite weapon. The family albums that used to live on the living room coffee table were moved to a shelf in the back study. She replaced them with sleek, minimalist art books. When her parents visited, she would stage elaborate family photos. "Let's get one of just our family unit," she would chirp, positioning David and her children, leaving me sitting on the sofa just outside the frame. The message was clear: you are not part of this unit. I was like wallpaper that hurt, present visible but utterly ignored. They would have conversations around me as if I wasn't there, discussing their plans for the future, for the company, for the money they were already spending. They talked about selling the house and buying something more modern, a place with a pool and a home theater. They spoke of it with such certainty, as if my consent was a foregone conclusion, a minor detail that didn't even warrant a discussion. My son was the most painful part of this slow diminishment. He saw what was happening. I would catch his eye, sometimes a flicker of guilt, of shame, before he would look away, unable to meet my gaze. He was a willing accomplice in my erasure, because it was easier than confronting his wife. He had chosen his side, and with every day that passed, he reinforced that choice. He let her refer to me as your mother when she was complaining to him, creating a distance, turning me from family into his problem to be managed. One afternoon, I was in the garden tending to the roses Noel had planted for me. Chloe came out, phone to her ear. "I know it's a process," she was saying to someone, her voice bright and false. "We have to be delicate. It's like managing a historic property. You have to gently phase out the old fixtures before you can install the new ones." She glanced at me, a quick, dismissive flick of her eyes, and then walked away. An old fixture. That's what I was. Not a mother, not a grandmother, not the woman who had co-created everything they now claimed as their own. Just an outdated part of the house that needed to be removed. I stood there, pruning shears in hand, and I did not feel sadness. I felt the cold, hard weight of a decision forming. Fixtures, I thought, can be surprisingly well-grounded. And sometimes they are the only thing holding the whole structure up. The blow fell exactly 2 weeks after Noel's funeral. The day had been quiet, heavy with an unspoken tension. Chloe had been on the phone all morning with a man I now understood was a realtor. Her voice was animated, excited. David had been pacing the house, looking anxious. They were waiting for the right moment. I do not shy away from the cruelty of the insults, leech-made old hag. I present them plainly because their ugliness is necessary to justify the final devastating consequences. It came after dinner. They asked me to join them in the living room, a room that no longer felt like mine. They sat together on the new minimalist sofa Chloe had ordered. I sat opposite them in my wingback chair, the last bastion of my existence in this space. It felt like a formal tribunal. David cleared his throat, refusing to meet my eyes. He started, his voice stilted. Mom, Chloe and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future. Chloe, impatient with his preamble, took over. She leaned forward, her expression a careful blend of feigned sympathy and firm resolve. Eleanor. She began using my first name, a calculated move to strip me of my maternal authority. We know this has been a terribly difficult time, and we've been trying to give you space to grieve. The lie was so audacious it was almost impressive, but she continued, her voice hardening slightly. The reality is this house it's too much. It's an enormous asset, and frankly, the capital is tied up. David needs to leverage it to secure the future of Bedrock. I remained silent, my hands folded calmly in my lap. My silence seemed to unnerve them. David shifted uncomfortably. Chloe pressed on. What we're trying to say is that we've made the decision to sell. The market is incredible right now. We have a realtor, he's very motivated. He thinks we can get it listed by the end of the month. Finally, I spoke. My voice was quiet, devoid of the emotion they were clearly expecting. And where am I to go? This was the part David was meant to handle. He cleared his throat again. Well, Mom, we found a few places. Really nice ones. Senior living communities. They have activities, and you'd be with people your own age. A nursing home, I stated not as a question, but as a translation. It's not a nursing home, Chloe jumped in a little too quickly. It's a luxury retirement village. But that's a down-the-road solution. For now. She paused, taking a breath for the final killing blow. For now, we need you to pack your things. The realtor says the house will show better if it's depersonalized. Less clutter. Her eyes, cold and clear, locked with mine. We need you to be out in 2 weeks. David finally looked at me, a pleading expression on his face, as if begging me to understand, to make this easy for him. But then Chloe added the final twist of the knife. After all, she said with a small, dismissive shrug, the house was in Noel's name. It was never really yours anyway. The words hung in the air. A declaration of my worthlessness, of my 50 years of life and love being reduced to a legal technicality they had fundamentally misunderstood. They thought they were delivering an eviction notice to a helpless old woman. They had no idea they had just handed her a declaration of war. In that moment, as Chloe's words echoed in the silent room, I did not feel the searing grief or the hot rage they had anticipated. I did not break down. I did not weep or plead. Instead, a profound and startling stillness settled over me. It was as if the shock of their cruelty had acted like a lightning strike on sand, fusing all my swirling emotions, the sorrow, the anger, the betrayal, into a single smooth, hard sheet of glass. Through it, I saw everything with a perfect, chilling clarity. I am the grandmother who sat in silence, not because I was weak, but because I was observing, remembering, and planning. They saw a frail widow, a relic to be disposed of. They saw a woman defined by her husband, whose value ceased to exist when he did. They had looked at me for years and had never truly seen me at all. They had forgotten my history, my strength, my role as the silent, steady architect of the very life they were so eager to claim. Their mistake was not just their cruelty. It was their profound, arrogant ignorance. I see, I said. My voice was unnervingly calm. It was the calm of a deep lake, its surface placid, while the currents below gathered force. My composure was their undoing. They had prepared for hysterics, for a negotiation born of desperation. They were completely disarmed by my quiet acceptance. David looked relieved, slumping back into the sofa. Chloe's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of suspicion, but she quickly masked it with a triumphant smile. They had won. It was that easy. Good, she said briskly. Standing up, the meeting concluded. I'm glad you're being sensible about this, Eleanor. It's for the best. I simply nodded. As they left the room, their voices already turning to logistics and realtors' fees, I remained seated in my chair. In my mind, a locked room I hadn't visited in years creaked open. I saw Noel's face, not as he was at the end, but years ago, looking hale and worried. I heard his voice, not in a memory of love, but in a memory of grim foresight. If anything ever happens to me, Ellie, he had said one night after a particularly grating visit from Chloe, you go to the downtown branch of the bank. The safe deposit box. The key is in my old copy of Moby Dick. Remember that. Only you. At the time, I had dismissed it as morbid thinking. Now I understood. It was a blueprint, a contingency plan, the key to the fortress he had built for me. I was no longer confused. I was no longer waiting for an apology. I was planning. I would let them have their 2 weeks. I would let them measure the curtains and list the house. I would let them parade strangers through my memories. I would let them believe they held all the cards, that they had won the jackpot. I would give them enough rope not to hang themselves, but to bind themselves so tightly in their own greed and debt that they would never untangle it. I rose from the chair, not for revenge, but for clarity. The kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you are owed. The next morning, the dynamic in the house was palpably different. David and Chloe moved with a new lightness, a sense of triumphant relief. They had faced the dragon, and it had simply nodded and agreed to leave its hoard. My compliance was to them proof of my weakness. I understand the precise 5-act structure required for these stories. The backstory of sacrifice, the slow erasure, the final insult, the quiet execution and the aftermath of consequences. I'll get some boxes from the office for you. Mom, David said, his tone now breezy and helpful. the guilt of the previous night washed away by the tide of his relief. "Thank you, David," I replied evenly, sipping my tea. "That would be very helpful." Chloe was already on the phone with the realtor, a man named Bill, her voice a symphony of business-like efficiency. "Yes, she's being very cooperative. A full vacancy by the 15th, absolutely. We can schedule the photographer for Monday." I said nothing. I finished my tea, washed my cup, and went upstairs. I did not begin to pack. Instead, I went to Noel's study, a room they had thus far ignored, and found his old dog-eared copy of Moby Dick. Tucked between the pages describing the great white whale was a small, cold brass key. I closed my hand around it, the metal a solid, tangible link to Noel's plan. It felt like a weapon. For the next few days, I became the very model of a meek, compliant widow. I allowed Chloe to walk me through a glossy brochure for a retirement community called Willow Creek Estates, nodding at the pictures of seniors playing shuffleboard and smiling vacuously. I listened as she explained the different living packages, my mind a million miles away, calculating my own next steps. They mistook my silence for surrender, my quietness for defeat. They didn't understand that silence had always been my workspace. It was in silence that I had balanced the company's books. It was in silence that I had listened to Noel's fears and dreams. And it was in this new, profound silence that I would dismantle their world. The realtor Bill came by. He was a man with a plastic smile and predatory eyes that appraised every corner of my home for its commission potential. Chloe led him on a grand tour, pointing out features while I was instructed to stay in the kitchen, out of the way. "The owner is just transitioning," I heard Chloe explain to him in a low, conspiratorial whisper. "An elderly woman, you know how it is, eager to downsize." I sat at the kitchen table, the one where I had helped David with his homework, and listened to Noel plan his first big project, and I felt nothing but a cold, motivating calm. They were writing a story about me, casting me as a tragic, forgetful old woman. They had no idea I was the author of the entire play, and the final act was going to be a masterpiece of procedural justice. I let them talk. I let them plan. And I said nothing at all. The following Monday, I told them I was going to visit an old friend. Chloe offered to drive me, her eagerness to see me out of the house barely concealed. "Of course, Eleanor. Take all the time you need," she chirped. I declined, saying the walk would do me good. I am intimately familiar with all variations of the matriarch's hidden power, from sole legal ownership of a house and majority shareholder status in a company to a supplemental will with a cruelty clause or full control of a trust account. But I didn't walk to a friend's house. I walked 2 blocks to the bus stop and took the crosstown bus to the heart of downtown. I walked into the imposing marble lobby of the First National Bank, the same bank that had given Noel his first business loan 50 years ago. The brass key felt cool and heavy in my pocket. I was led to the vault, a place of hushed tones and heavy steel. A young clerk, polite and efficient, used my key and his own to open safe deposit box 417. He slid out the long metal container and placed it on a table in a small, private viewing room, then left, closing the door behind him. For a moment, I just stared at the box. It was a time capsule, a final message from the man I loved. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no jewelry, no stacks of cash. There was only paper. thick stacks of it bound neatly with rubber bands. On top lay a single sealed envelope with one word written on it in Noel's familiar strong handwriting, Eleanor. I opened it. The letter was dated 6 months before he died. "My dearest Ellie," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I can only hope my fears were unfounded. But I have seen the way Chloe looks at what we've built, and I have seen the weakness in our son's eyes when he is with her. I fear they will not honor you. I fear they will see you as a relic, an obstacle to their inheritance. Love is not enough to protect you from greed, Ellie. So I have used what I know best, a solid foundation. You will find in this box the documents for the Bedrock Irrevocable Trust. Several years ago, I transferred full ownership of Bedrock Construction. Every share, every asset, every piece of property and equipment into this trust. It was done quietly, legally, and completely. The company you and I built together does not belong to my estate. It belongs to the trust. And my love, you are the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. You own it all, Ellie. The company, the accounts, the house on Sycamore Street, which is a corporate asset. Everything. They have no claim, no say, no power. It is all yours to manage to sell to do with as you wish. Paper remembers what people forget, and this paper remembers that you were always my equal partner. I have also enclosed the documents for another smaller trust. It holds the deed to the little cottage on the coast we always talked about. I bought it for you 5 years ago. It's your sanctuary if you ever need it. Protect yourself, my love. Be the strong, smart woman I always knew. I love you more than all the buildings I have ever built. Noel. Tears finally came, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of overwhelming love and gratitude for this man who had known me so well, who had seen the storm coming and had built me an ark. I wiped my eyes, my resolve hardening from steel into diamond. I carefully put the letter away and began to review the documents, my mind, the one that had balanced ledgers and negotiated with suppliers, clicking back into gear. I was no longer Eleanor the widow. I was Eleanor the sole owner of Bedrock Construction. And my first order of business was a hostile takeover of my own life. The next document I pulled from the box was a business card, crisp and new. James P. Caldwell, attorney at law. Underneath in Noel's handwriting were the words, "He knows everything. Trust him." My methodology for resolving conflict is always through established formal systems. I leverage lawyers, bank managers, legal documents, and corporate structures to deliver consequences. James had been Noel's lawyer and friend for over 40 years. He was a quiet, shrewd man with eyes that missed nothing, a perfect legal counterpart to Noel's bold, visionary spirit. I hadn't seen him since the funeral, where he had given me a long, meaningful look and squeezed my hand, saying, "Call me if you need anything at all, Eleanor." Anything. At the time, I thought it was just a kind platitude. Now I understood it was an invitation. Back at home, I waited until David and Chloe were out for the evening, celebrating their impending real estate windfall with a lavish dinner. In the quiet of Noel's study, I dialed the number on the card. James answered on the second ring. "Caldwell." "James, it's Eleanor." "Eleanor Vance." There was a pause, and then his voice warmed with a genuine kindness that was a balm to my weary soul. "Eleanor, I was hoping you'd call. I take it you've been to the bank." "I have," I said, my own voice, steady. I've read Noel's letter. Good, he said simply. There was no surprise in his tone. Then you know the situation. Noel was a brilliant man, not just with buildings, but with people. He saw this coming a long way off. He certainly did, I murmured, looking at the trust documents spread across the desk. James, they've told me I have 2 weeks to leave my home. A low, angry sound came from his end of the line. They did? Did they? The sheer audacity. He paused. Eleanor, what do you want to do? It was the first time in weeks anyone had asked me what I wanted. The question itself felt like a gift. I want to let them proceed, I said the plan, solidifying in my mind as I spoke it aloud. They have a realtor. They're planning to list the house. They believe they are days away from a massive payday. I want them to get to the very edge of that cliff before they realize the ground beneath their feet belongs to me. James was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear the legal gears turning in his sharp mind. A lesson in contract law and property rights. Poetic. Noel would have loved it. He continued, his voice all business now. All right, Eleanor, here's what we'll do. Let them get an offer. Let them get to the point of signing a preliminary sales agreement. That's the moment of maximum leverage. I will draw up a cease and desist for the realtor and a full accounting of the trust's assets. We will also prepare notices for the banks regarding the unauthorized expenditures and loans they've likely taken against the company. We will let them walk into the trap, and I will be there with you when you spring it. Relief washed over me so potent it almost buckled my knees. I wasn't alone in this. I had a team. A quiet, formidable man of the law and the ghost of the brilliant, loving man who had laid the groundwork for this final, necessary battle. Thank you, James, I whispered. Don't thank me, Eleanor, he said, his voice firm. I'm just honoring my friend's last and most important blueprint. The next week was a surreal performance. I played the part of the fading, compliant widow to perfection, while David and Chloe rampaged through my life with the giddy energy of lottery winners. The house was in a constant state of upheaval. My primary function is to guide the audience on a specific emotional journey, from pity and anger on the protagonist's behalf to tense anticipation during her planning to deep cathartic satisfaction when her quiet plan succeeds and the 99+ missed calls begin. The photographer came on Monday. Chloe followed him around, directing him to capture the best angles, while I was politely instructed to remain in my bedroom. I listened to the sound of his camera shutter clicking, documenting the life I was about to lose, and felt a strange, detached calm. They were taking pictures of a stage set, unaware that the director was about to change the script entirely. On Wednesday, the realtor Bill returned this time with a measuring tape and a notepad. Chloe was his shadow, her voice a constant stream of suggestions. This wall can come down to create an open-concept living space, she'd announced, gesturing grandly. And the kitchen needs a complete gut renovation. I'm thinking Italian marble. I sat in my wingback chair reading a book, a ghost in the corner of the room. At one point, Bill approached me, his smile stretched thin. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Vance," he said, patting my shoulder with a condescending familiarity. "We'll find you a lovely new place. Something more manageable." I simply smiled back, a serene, placid smile that seemed to confuse him. "I'm sure you will," I said. The peak of the performance came on Thursday. Chloe had decided the curtains, the heavy damask ones Noel and I had picked out together, were too dated and had to go. She spent the afternoon on a stepladder, clumsily unhooking them, chattering to David about replacing them with automated blinds. "It will increase the sale value, you'll see," she said, panting slightly as she wrestled with a heavy swag of fabric. I watched her struggle, this woman who was literally tearing down the fabric of my life to profit from it. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They were measuring the curtains for a ghost, planning the decor for a house they had no right to, all while the true owner sat 10 feet away, watching, waiting, and saying nothing. My role was to be invisible, and I played it flawlessly. I was the silent observer, the quiet keeper of truths they were too arrogant to see. Each act of theirs, every measurement, every phone call, every boastful plan was another thread in a web they were weaving around themselves. They thought they were staging my exit. In reality, I was stage managing their downfall, and the curtain was about to rise on the final devastating act. The open house was scheduled for Saturday. Chloe insisted it was essential. "It creates a buzz, a sense of competition," she explained to David, as if she were a seasoned real estate mogul. For me, it was the ultimate humiliation, a public auction of my private life. To maintain authenticity, my storytelling must be a craft, not a simple algorithm. Mechanical repetition is the antithesis of the true story feel. She gave me my instructions that morning. "Eleanor, it would be best if you weren't here. It can make buyers uncomfortable to have the current owner lurking around." Her choice of the word lurking was a small, deliberate cruelty. "But if you insist on staying, please remain in the garden. You can say you're a neighbor if anyone asks." I agreed with a placid nod. I had no intention of leaving. I wanted to witness this. At 2:00 sharp, the invasion began. Cars lined the street. Bill, the realtor, stood at the front door handing out glossy brochures that described my home as a prime redevelopment opportunity. Strangers swarmed through the rooms I had shared with Noel for half a century. They opened my closets, peered into my pantry, and commented on the layout with the cold, critical eyes of consumers. I sat on a small bench in the rose garden, a book open in my lap, though I didn't read a word. I was a guest at the viewing of my own life. A woman with 2 young children walked by, and I heard the child ask Mommy, "Who is that old lady?" The mother glanced at me and replied, "That's nobody, sweetie, just the gardener." Chloe, ever the gracious host, floated through the crowd, pointing out the good bones of the house and sharing her grand vision for its renovation. I saw her talking to a wealthy-looking couple in the kitchen. "Of course all this would be replaced," she said, waving a dismissive hand at the solid oak cabinets Noel had installed himself. "We envision a chef's kitchen, state-of-the-art appliances. The potential is limitless." Her performance was seamless. She was the lady of the manor, graciously allowing the public a glimpse before she passed it on to its next discerning owner. David stood beside her, a proud consort, nodding in agreement. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, cold resolve. I took out my small, hidden phone, a simple flip phone James had given me, untraceable by my family, and I took a photograph. A photo of the crowd in my living room. A photo of Chloe holding a champagne flute, laughing with potential buyers. I was documenting the depth of their deception, the sheer scale of their arrogance. This wasn't just a house to them. It was a prop in the play of their upwardly mobile lives. And I was just a character to be written out of the script. But the final scene was yet to be written, and I was holding the pen. The open house was not the end of my story. It was the climax of theirs. The call came on Monday morning. I was in the kitchen when Chloe let out a shriek of delight. Her phone pressed to her ear. "Are you serious, Bill? That's fantastic." Yes, yes. Of course we accept. My communication style will adapt to the narrative phase. During the slow eraser phase, my tone will be reflective and descriptive. During the quiet execution phase, my language will become more procedural and direct. She hung up and turned to David, her face flushed with victory. We got it. A cash offer 10% over asking. No contingencies. They want to close in 30 days. David whooped and grabbed her, swinging her around in a circle. We did it, Chloe. We actually did it. They were ecstatic, giddy with the thrill of their massive, unearned windfall. They embraced in the middle of the kitchen, laughing, already spending the money in their heads. A new car for him, a trip to Paris for her private schools for the kids. Their future was set. I watched them from the doorway, a silent, unmoving figure. They were so lost in their celebration that they barely noticed me. "Mom, did you hear?" David finally said, turning to me, his eyes shining. "The house is sold. We're all set." "That's wonderful news," I said, my voice perfectly neutral. Chloe, feeling magnanimous in her triumph, patted my arm. "See, Eleanor, I told you this was for the best. Now we can get you settled into Willow Creek without any financial worries. You'll be so comfortable." The final meeting was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon at the house. Bill, the realtor, would bring the official purchase and sale agreement for them to sign. It was a formality, he had explained, but a necessary step to lock in the buyers. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the stage I had let them set. I called James. "They have the offer," I told him. "The signing is Wednesday at 3. "Perfect," he said, his voice calm and ready. "The trap is set. The bait has been taken. I will be there at 2:45. Have the documents Noel left you ready. It's time to remind them who owns the bedrock." The next 48 hours were a blur of their excitement. They were constantly on the phone talking to their friends, their financial advisor, their parents. They were discussing capital gains and investment strategies. They were divvying up a fortune that was never theirs, while I, the true owner of that fortune, moved silently through the house, making my own quiet preparations. I packed one small suitcase, not with the contents of my life, but with the essentials for my new one. And in a handsome leather briefcase Noel had once used, I placed the thick file containing the irrevocable trust documents, his final letter, and the deed to a small cottage on the coast. They were busy celebrating the sale of my house. I was busy preparing to move into my home. Wednesday afternoon arrived, draped in a brilliant, clear sunlight that seemed to mock the storm about to break. At 3 o'clock, we were all gathered around the grand dining room table. David and Chloe sat on one side, beaming, their faces glowing with greed and anticipation. Bill, the realtor, sat at the head, his briefcase open, the thick stack of sales documents laid out before him, like a feast. I sat on the other side, alone, a small, unassuming figure. I had my leather briefcase on the floor beside my chair. In the conclusion, My voice will become more philosophical and directly address the audience, ensuring a dynamic and emotionally resonant delivery. Well, this is an exciting day. Bill began rubbing his hands together. He slid the top copy of the agreement toward David. If you'll just sign here and here, and Chloe, your signature here as spouse. David picked up the expensive fountain pen Chloe had bought him for the occasion. He uncapped it with a flourish. This was his moment, the moment he officially became the man of the house, the master of his own destiny. He was about to touch the pen to the paper when the doorbell rang. Chloe frowned. Are we expecting someone? As a matter of fact, I said, my voice cutting through the room with a quiet authority that made them all turn to look at me. I am. I rose from my chair and went to the door. Standing on the porch was James P. Caldwell, looking impeccable in a dark gray suit, carrying a briefcase identical to my own. James, I said with a small smile. Thank you for coming. Please join us. I led him back to the dining room. David and Chloe stared, confused. Bill looked annoyed by the interruption. Mom, who is this? David asked. This is James Caldwell, I announced, returning to my seat. He was your father's attorney. I then reached down, lifted my briefcase onto the table, and opened it with a decisive click. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Before you sign that, I said, my eyes locked on David. There is another document you need to see. I slid a thick, bound portfolio across the polished wood of the table. It stopped directly in front of David. On the cover, in bold letters, were the words, "The Bedrock Irrevocable Trust." He stared at it blankly. What is this? That, James, said, his voice filling the room, is the controlling document for Bedrock Construction and all its assets, including this house. It was established by Noel Vance 5 years ago. He transferred 100% of the company and its properties into this trust. Chloe let out a short, sharp laugh. That's ridiculous. The company is part of the estate. David is the heir. I'm afraid not, James said calmly. Assets within an irrevocable trust bypass the estate entirely. They are not subject to probate. They belong to the trust. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And the sole trustee and beneficiary of the Bedrock Irrevocable Trust, he looked directly at me, is Eleanor Vance. The color drained from David's face. Chloe's jaw went slack. No, she whispered. That's impossible. Oh, it's quite possible. I said, my voice as cold and hard as marble. Paper, you see, remembers what people forget. And this paper remembers that I was a partner, not a dependent. I leaned forward slightly. This is my company. This is my house. And you have absolutely no authority to sell it. I then turned to the stunned realtor. Bill, I believe this meeting is over, and if you or your agency ever set foot on my property again, Mr. Caldwell will be in touch regarding fraudulent representation and attempting to sell property without the legal owner's consent. Bill scrambled to his feet, stuffing papers into his briefcase, his face a mask of panic. He practically ran from the room. The silence that remained was absolute. David stared at the trust document as if it were a snake. Chloe stared at me, her face a maelstrom of disbelief, fury, and dawning abject horror. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen, and they were left on a dark stage with no lines, no audience, and no escape. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of silent, imploding shock. David's hand, still holding the fountain pen, trembled so violently that a single drop of black ink fell onto the pristine sales agreement, a dark tear on their shattered dreams. Chloe's face had gone from pale to a mottled, unhealthy red. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. My strength is not in avoiding pain, but in transforming it into righteous action. It was the ringing of David's phone that finally broke the spell. He fumbled for it, his eyes still locked on the trust document. The caller ID flashed, First Sterling Bank. It's the bank, he stammered, looking at Chloe with panicked eyes. Don't answer it, she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. As if on cue, her own phone began to buzz on the table, a frantic, insistent vibration. She glanced down. American Express Platinum Services. James cleared his throat softly. I took the liberty of informing the relevant financial institutions of the true ownership of the company. This morning, he said, his tone matter of fact. I imagine they are calling about the substantial personal expenditures charged to corporate accounts you do not control, and perhaps about the rather large bridge loan you took out against an inheritance you will not be receiving, the six-figure debt, the SUV, the vacation, the renovations. It all came crashing down on them in that single horrifying moment. The life of luxury they had been prepaying for was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide had just come in. You did this, Chloe finally spat at me, her voice thick with hatred. You scheming old hag. You sat there and watched us. Yes, I replied, my voice calm and even. I did. I watched you try to erase me. I watched you try to discard me. I watched you try to sell my home and my husband's legacy out from under me. I simply decided not to let you. I stood up and picked up my briefcase. James stood with me. David. Chloe. You have 24 hours to vacate my property. I suggest you start packing. You seem to have some experience with it. I turned and walked away, James beside me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. As we walked out the front door, I could hear Chloe begin to scream, a raw, primal sound of pure fury and thwarted greed. I spent that night in a quiet hotel suite that James had booked for me. I turned off the phone number they knew and turned on the simple flip phone. The next morning, I checked it. There were 62 missed calls from David, 37 from Chloe. Dozens of frantic, rambling voicemails filled with threats, pleas, and incoherent rage. I listened to none of them. Later that day, James called me on my new secure line. They're gone, he said. They took their cars and their clothes and left. The house is empty. It's yours again, Eleanor. Completely. No, James, I said, looking out the hotel window at the city lights. It was always mine. They were just the guests who overstayed their welcome. I hung up the phone. The symphony of their missed calls finally silenced, replaced by the quiet, peaceful hum of my own reclaimed life. I never went back to the house on Sycamore Street. It was filled with too many ghosts, the ghost of my beloved Noel, and the far more toxic ghosts of my son's betrayal and my daughter-in-law's greed. James, acting on my instructions, had the property cleared out and sold within 2 months. The proceeds, along with the now stabilized profits from bedrock construction, which I had put under new trustworthy management, funded my new beginning. My new home is the little cottage on the coast Noel bought for me. It's not grand, but it's mine. From my porch, I can see the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The air is clean and salty, and the only sound is the rhythmic crash of waves on the shore. Here, the silence is not a weapon or a shield. It is peace. I hear things sometimes through the grapevine. I hear that David and Chloe are living in a small rented apartment across the state. They are buried in debt-facing lawsuits from the credit card companies and the banks. Bedrock, under my ownership, refused to cover their personal liabilities. They called me dead weight, and now they are crushed under the weight of their own choices. My son has tried to call using his children as an excuse. He leaves rambling messages about forgiveness, about family, but he never uses the one word that might have mattered, sorry. His apologies are for himself, not for what he did to me. Love without respect is not love. It is an obligation. And I have fulfilled my obligations. If you are listening to this story and you have ever been made to feel invisible, like a piece of furniture in your own life, if you have ever been called a burden by the very people you have spent your life supporting, if you have ever been told you are not enough, then know this: you are not alone. They may try to erase you to write you out of the story, but you are the author. You hold the pen. Your worth is not determined by their valuation. It is a bedrock, a foundation that you built with your own life, your own sacrifices, your own quiet strength. I sit here now on my porch with a glass of good wine, and I watch the sun set over the water. It paints the sky in strokes of apricot and violet. I am not the villain in their story. I am not the savior either. I am simply the lesson. The lesson that a foundation, when it is truly strong, cannot be shaken. I didn't lose a home. I reclaimed a world. And the view is magnificent. Eleanor's story is not just about a house or a company. It's about the quiet strength that is so often mistaken for weakness. It is a testament to the fact that the most powerful foundations are not always visible to the naked eye. If you have ever poured your life into building something, a family, a home, a dream, only to be told you are in the way, then know this: your contribution is not invisible, and your silence is not surrender. It is preparation. That is why we are here. At True Stories. She Never Told we give voice to the women who have been dismissed, sharing the moments of profound clarity when they decide they are done being erased. What would you have done in Eleanor's place? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If these stories speak to a part of you that feels unseen, don't forget to subscribe to True Stories. She Never Told, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of quiet justice. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching True Stories She Never Told.